Here's a question. What's the fastest a global empire has ever disappeared? Not a company, an empire. In 2007, one company sold half of every phone on Earth, 463 million of them in a single year. It was worth $250 billion. Its ringtone was probably the most played melody in human history. In its home country, it wasn't a company. It was practically the flag. 6 years later, it sold what was left of that phone business for $7 billion, about 3 cents on the dollar of its peak, to a buyer who shut most of it down within 2 years. Nokia, 6 years, top of the world to gone. And the terrifying part, the part that keeps every CEO alive today up at night, is that almost every decision along the way looked reasonable when it was made. Follow the money. First, understand how unlikely this empire was. Nokia started in 1865 as a paper mill in a Finnish forest town. Over a century, it made rubber boots, tires, cables, televisions, a conglomerate of whatever Finland needed. Then, in the early 90s, it made one of the great bets in industrial history. It sold off everything else and went all in on a gadget most people had never held: a mobile phone. By 1998, it had passed Motorola to become the world's #1. By 2007, the numbers stopped sounding like business and started sounding like geography. Phones in every market on the planet, market share around 50%. And in Finland, Nokia alone accounted for roughly a fifth of the country's exports. Its models were icons: the 3310 you could allegedly drop off a building, the N95 that could do almost everything. Almost everything. Hold that thought, and the scale of the machine behind those icons is hard to overstate. At its peak, Nokia was producing phones at a rate of more than a dozen every second, around the clock, out of factories on 3 continents. A logistics operation that competitors studied like a natural wonder. It employed well over 100,000 people. Its brand ranked among the 5 most valuable on the planet, alongside Coca-Cola and Microsoft. When economists wrote about Finland in those years, they had a running joke that the country had 3 pillars: forests, engineering, and Nokia. Because here's what the empire looked like from inside in early 2007. Unbeatable hardware, factories tuned like Swiss watches, deep friendships with every phone carrier on Earth, and a mountain of cash. If you were on the board, you would have seen no cliff. You would have seen open road. In January 2007, Steve Jobs walked onto a stage in San Francisco and pulled a slab of glass out of his pocket. Nokia's engineers watched, and, this is documented, not legend, many were unimpressed. No physical keyboard, terrible battery, a fragile screen. Twice the price, it couldn't even send picture messages properly. On every spec sheet Nokia used to measure phones, the iPhone lost. And that was precisely the problem. The iPhone wasn't a better phone, it was a computer wearing a phone costume. And Nokia was measuring it with phone rulers. Now the darker detail, Nokia knew. Its labs had built touchscreen prototypes years before the iPhone. It had an internet tablet on sale. Engineers had pitched app stores and internet-first devices internally. The future was literally sitting in the building, and it kept getting shelved. Why? Because every radical device risked cannibalizing the machine that printed money. Hundreds of millions of Symbian phones sold through carrier partners who wanted predictable products. At margins, the radical stuff couldn't yet match. And Symbian, the software running those hundreds of millions of phones, was quietly rotting underneath. It had been designed for keypads and tiny screens, then stretched and forked across so many incompatible device variants that developers had to rebuild the same app dozens of times. While Apple offered developers one screen, one store, and 70% of every sale, building for Nokia felt like filing paperwork in a bureaucracy. The apps went where the friction wasn't. And in the new game, the apps were the product. The strength was the trap. 50% market share is 50% of your revenue held hostage by yesterday's platform. The carriers loved Nokia as it was. The installed base needed Symbian maintained. The hardware culture saw software as packaging. Every incentive in the world's best phone company pointed away from building the thing that would kill it, so someone else built it. And in 2008, Google gave that thing away to every other manufacturer for free. Android didn't beat Nokia on quality, it beat Nokia on permission. Everyone else had nothing to lose. By 2011, Nokia was wounded, but but still the world's largest phone maker. Then it did something almost no company has done. It shot itself. The new CEO, Stephen Elop, wrote a memo to all staff comparing Nokia to a man on a burning oil platform who must leap into icy water. Symbian, he wrote, was obsolete. Nokia was years behind. The memo leaked. Of course it leaked. And overnight, Nokia had announced to every customer and carrier on Earth that its own products were walking dead. The replacement, Windows Phone, was a year away. Sales of the platform that still paid every salary collapsed immediately. Business schools had a name for this: the Osborne effect, after a computer maker that killed itself the same way in the 80s announced the death of what you sell before the successor exists, and customers simply stopped buying. Nokia bet what remained on being the third ecosystem against Apple and Google. The third ecosystem never came. In 2013, Microsoft bought Nokia's phone business, the business that had been worth $250 billion, for about $7 billion. Within a few years, Microsoft wrote nearly all of it off and shut it down. Barely 2 years after the purchase, Microsoft admitted the phones couldn't be saved either. It wrote off nearly the entire $7 billion, cut tens of thousands of the jobs it had acquired, and quietly stopped making the phones altogether. The empire didn't just change hands, it evaporated in them. At the announcement press conference, one of Nokia's leaders said the sentence that became the whole story's epitaph. Quoted everywhere since, "We didn't do anything wrong, but somehow we lost." Both halves of that sentence are true. That's the lesson. Nobody at Nokia was lazy or stupid. Every quarter, protecting the cash machine was the rational choice. The mistake wasn't a decision, it was a scoreboard. Nokia measured better phones, while the game quietly became software ecosystems. When the game changes, excellence at the old game becomes a liability with momentum. So here's the transferable test. For companies, careers, portfolios, write down the 3 strengths you'd brag about. Then ask for each one. If the game changed tomorrow, does this strength help me move, or does it pay me to stand still? Installed bases, key relationships, mastery of a craft. The moment they start paying you to stand still, they've flipped sign. Nokia's collapse took 6 years. The flip happened silently, years before, while the numbers still said empire. And one closing twist, Nokia the company never actually died. It sold the phones, kept the plumbing, and today it's one of the world's biggest telecom network builders. The empire fell. The company survived by amputating everything it had been famous for. Sometimes that's the only move left. Better to choose your amputation before the platform starts burning. That's how half the world's phones vanished in 6 years. Next week, the man who sold the Eiffel Tower twice.